Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks first to Sarah and Megan for their very kind invitation. It would be easy and perhaps a rewarding task to demonstrate how the photography of sculpture by nationalists in the early 20th century played a key role in the development of the visual language of modern Indian politics. A central place in this regard would be the still almost unknown Maharashtrian Narayan Vinayak Virkar, a photographer who worked closely with Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the leader of the so-called extremist faction based in Pune and Bombay. Virkar, in addition to extensively photographing Tilak, both in life and death, would also document many of the sculptural traces upon which Tilak built his religious nationalist project. This included statues of the elephant-headed god Ganesh, whose public celebration and immersion Tilak would encourage as a way of facilitating quasi-political mass gatherings of Hindus, which colonial laws otherwise forbade, and the new cult around Shivaji, the 17th century Maratha opponent of the Mughals, whose earlier resistance was now to be replayed as a template for opposition to British oppression. Virkar photographed busts of Shivaji, which would form the basis for numerous later chromolithographs and whose legacy is still visible in stickers to be found in many Mumbai taxis and auto rickshaws. Further, Virkar would also, in the early 1920s, be heavily involved in a nationalist archaeological project to document and restore Shivaji's forts on the Western Ghats. The patron deities of shrines in these forts associated with Shiv and Hanuman would also in turn feed into a developing politicized iconography, which is still highly visible in today's Western India. Each year on Anand Chodas, on blissful 14th, hundreds of thousands of Ganesh statues are immersed in the Arabian Ocean from Girgaon Beach and other locations in Mumbai, to the increasing accompaniment of a new relationship between sculpture and photography. F.W. Stevens' monstrously Gothic Victoria Terminus railway station has been renamed the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, and a massive equestrian statue of Shivaji now faces the gateway of India on Apollo Bunda. These are all, in a very direct way, partly the legacy of Virkar's early 20th century photography of sculpture. However, rather than confine myself to this rather conventional historiographic and art historical pathway, I will attempt something more freewheeling and, I hope, more useful, an investigation of the ethnosociology of the relationship between sculpture and photography. I will explore the anthropologist Makim Marriott's demand that we should search out not what he describes as the social solidarities that conventional Western social theory has bequeathed us, but rather the fluidarities of Indian thought and practice. Following the fluidarity of practice, the partibility of entities, and the flows of biomoral substance that configure identity in India will involve strange conjunctions and unexpected alignments, separations, and implosions. With this in mind, please forgive me the following experiment. I've often wondered how Oliver Wendell Holmes would have responded to lenticular prints, the new kind of ambiguously photographic images through which Indians increasingly greet their gods. As with Brit's material, there's a problem in how one photographs and displays these, and anyone who wants to play with them later is most welcome. Usually made in China, but largely commissioned by Indian firms, their footpath vendors, whenever I've quizzed them on their Hindi name, have always told me that they are called 3D, or sometimes Ek Mein Do Hai, 2 in 1. So if you will allow an attempt to generate what Holmes called a rushing freshet of fertilizing talk, we have to imagine him marveling not at the coincidence of railways, the telegraph, and apple-flavored chloroform with photography, but at the coincidence of mobile phones and the internet with a new lenticular technology which animates the gods ever more efficaciously. In that patient way he had when explaining new marvels for those who had not yet seen them, he would have set out the mode of their making. 2 or more images are printed on synthetic paper as fine interlaced strips, which are spliced between a lenticular lens, packed like the leaves of a closed book, Holmes might have said, before falling into a poetic reverie when confronting the phenomenology of viewing these images. He would also have pointed out that with up to 30 splices, it is possible to sediment up to 1 minute of video effect in a practically flat surface. Holmes would undoubtedly have predicted a future, perhaps only a few years away, when we will be able to read entire Bollywood movies from the plasticized and slightly reticulated surface of the lenticular print. He would doubtless have hailed this, quote, triumph of human ingenuity and inconceivable wonder, while also acknowledging that this was stereoscopy by other means. Some of the key terms of the reverie are easy to imagine, but we would have to inflect it with a theory of vision different from Baudelairean effluences or effigies, membranes or films, to quote Holmes. Instead, Holmes would need to articulate a Central Indian theory of extramissive vision whose primary idiom is liquid and reciprocal, capable of conceiving of vision as a fluid exchange between devotee and deity and through which biomoral substance is transmitted. Recall how Holmes, at the very moment of his ecstasy about the powers of the new magical photography, quote, the divine gift, which through stereoscopy had acquired the power of depth, is already imagining cinematic movement, quote, by means of 2 different views of an object, the mind, as it were, feels round it and gets an idea of its solidity. Holmes then imagines how to surpass the limitations of stasis, in which, as he notes, motion is as rigid as marble if you only take a wink's worth of it at a time, and comments that motion is but a succession of rests. So imagine Holmes's response to 2 lenticular prints of a shrine to the god Shiv at Amarnath in Jammu and Kashmir in the Himalayas. The first shows us a shrine at some distance. We are aware of a cave set within grey stone, above which we see some bright blue sky. At the bottom of the entrance of the cave is a low red iron fence, on top of which 2 white doves perch. There is a trishul or trident, a conventional sign of Shiv's presence, to the left of the cave. To the right of the cave is a milky white shivling. Etically speaking, this is an ice stalagmite growing vertically from the cave floor at an altitude of almost 4,000 meters. Emically speaking, it's the phallic and iconic symbol of Shiv's power. As we move nearer to the cave, moving our head to left or right, the white shivling instantly melts, and we see the god Shiv and his consort Parvati, to whom he's explaining the meaning of the cosmos. Shiv's right hand is raised in a blessing, and Parvati holds her hands in prayerful submission and lowers her head. Excuse me. The second image places us much closer to the cave. Viewed face on, one sees set within a 3-dimensional depth the same milky white shivling, which is the main object of worship. It is set behind the red iron fence, which the doves by now are standing in front of. Within the shivling, there is evidence of some indistinct divine presence. And when the viewer moves their head to the right, an image of the god Shiv clearly emerges. He wears a Rudraksha necklace and is garlanded with a cobra. His eyes are partly closed and he has a serene appearance. When the viewer moves to the left of the image, Shiv reappears, this time with a leftward focus, and the tongue of the cobra that graces his neck is more obviously visible. I've suggested that Holmes requires a translation of some kind from the Cartesian dualist world of Cambridge, Massachusetts, to the monist world of Hinduism, configured by particle bodies and the flows of biomoral substances. But actually, this is a movement that requires little effort. Holmes's enthusiasm for the divinatory power of photography forces him to imagine a world which many rural Indians would recognize. I quote, "What if the sky is one great concave mirror," he writes, "which reflects the picture of all our doings, and photographs every act upon which it looks upon dead and living surfaces, so that to celestial eyes the stones on which we tread are written with our deeds, and the leaves of the forest are but undeveloped negatives, where our summers stand self-recorded into the imperishable record, end quote. And it strikes me that's an observation that would make a great deal of sense to the rural Indians I work with. Last year, for instance, a Jain guru visited the village for the first time. This was an enormously important event for village Jains, and the climax of his visit was marked by the making of multiple puglias. His feet are bathed in saffron, and they're used to photograph his print onto these cotton squares. So these are indexes of his feet, proto-photographs, which themselves become the subject of endless, more conventional re-photography. And thinking about that Holmes quote, villagers would be able to make a great deal of sense of the local topography of sacred sites, especially clan shrines. So very frequently, aniconic shrines that are hugely important on a regular basis to mark rite de passage have a geographical indexicality. They mark a site in which an ancestor declared a desire to reside there, or in which they were immobilized, quite commonly bitten by a snake, for instance, underneath a tree under which they then recovered. So a lot of what Holmes has to say about the divinatory potential of this great concave mirror seems to resonate, certainly for rural villagers. Would resonate if they were reading Oliver Wendell Holmes. We can explore a different, though equally fluid, relation between photography and sculpture in relation to the important ecumenical figure of Sai Baba from Shirdi in Maharashtra. Born in the 1830s and dying in 1918, he's one of an interesting class of saints and proto-divines in India who was undoubtedly photographed during their lifetime. Others include the Calcutta mystic Ramakrishna, who you see here on the left, and then chromolithographed with the goddess Kali and the mother on the right, Swami Vivekananda, who I'm not going to show you, and the Sufi healer Taj-ud-Din Baba, whose chromolithographs are clearly based on actual photographs made during his lifetime. Indeed, in 3 very widely reproduced offset chromolithographic images based on photographic reference, the legend original photograph, which you can see less clearly bottom left here and more clearly on the right, very frequently appears in English. But Persian indexicality alone is insufficient in this context to underwrite Sai Baba's status as a candidate pantheon object. The move is effected through the transformation of the photograph into a sculpture, which is then transformed back into a photograph. So here you have a mixture of things that clearly have photographic references, photographs of statues, and then on the right, to return to Narayan Vinayak Virkar, his photograph of a painting based on one of those photographs. The logic here seems to be that the photograph places Sai Baba in too grounded a manner in the mundane world. Extra mundaneity is signified more potently through the statue, and hence devotees are more likely to worship a photograph or offset photochromolithograph of a statue than a copy of the original photograph on which the statue was based. The statue, or murti, shifts the register from the exorbitance and contingency of the photographic index into the reduced, clarified, and authorized space of the temple. So you also have many instances where photographs of these statues are co-opted by other aspirant holy persons. Here, a very controversial figure with a great local following called Nirmal Baba, whose photograph you can see on the left, alongside a photograph, and what I want to stress here, a photograph of a statue of Sai Baba, that person of whom we do have several direct photographs. It is perhaps significant that in the last 2 weeks, Sai Baba, whose mantra is Sabke Malik Ek Hai, all gods are one, should have come under fierce attack from an eccentric 99-year-old Hindu guru by the name of Swami Swarupananda Saraswati, who has instructed his followers and other Hindus not to worship Sai Baba since he is insufficiently Hindu. Swami Swarupananda argues that Sai Baba is merely a saint, not a god, is an artifact of television cinema. His hybridity has always been warmly embraced by an ecumenical Bollywood and is probably more of a Muslim than a Hindu. He appears to have been a meat-eater. I mention this controversy in part because this 99-year-old guru's name, Swarupananda, blissful self-made image, draws our attention to the different kinds of sculptures or forms that crowd the Indian pantheon. Sai Baba's statue is a straightforward murti, and it is a demographic fact that most of these were probably made by Muslims. Historically, marble carvers in North India have been largely Muslim. So this is a Hindu selling idols in an idol shop, a caricature from a missionary text, but it may well be that the images themselves were made by Muslims. Our guru's name, however, that is the aforesaid Swarupananda, alerts us to another category of more powerful sculpture or form, the Swarup, or self-made form, also known as Swayambhu. Such images, of which there are many, although overall in the scheme of things they are very rare, are autogenerative. Perhaps the most famous, fortuitously for my purposes, is also the one which lies at the ground zero of mass-produced devotional photos as chromolithographs. So I should stress here that ethnosociologically speaking, chromolithographs are also called photos. So I wrote a book once called Photos of the Gods, translated from the term Bhagwan ki photo, but that is a book about the history of chromolithography, not photography. The Swarup in question is that of Srinathji, a form of Krishna who started to make himself gradually visible as he emerged from Mount Govardhan in Braj in northern India around 1472. This was Krishna's birthplace, and Govardhan was the hill which Krishna had used as an umbrella to shelter the cattle of Braj from excessive monsoon rain. After the Swarup had fully revealed himself, self-agentively, it became the focus of an important cult presided over by Vallabha Acharya and his successors. In September 1670, however, with the threat of destruction of Hindu idols by Aurangzeb looming, Srinathji's devotees fled, taking the Swarup west in a covered cart towards Rajasthan, waiting for a sign from the Swarup that it had found a new abode. The cart got stuck in the mud at the place which is now named Nathdwara, Portal of the Lord, and this was taken as the Swarup's declaration of its desire to remain in this place. A new and now extensively documented tradition of painting and publicity grew up around Srinathji in this new location. Photography by camera of the Swarup has always been and remains to this day prohibited, but it has always been at the center of practices of representation which have through the centuries increasingly taken on the quality of mechanical reproduction. Male Brahmin artists painted pitchwise or decorative backdrops, which themselves, in the absence of the photographically tabooed Swarup, became the subject of early photographic attention. Female artists mass-produced fluid images that depicted Srinathji in his various darshanas or shingaras, revelations and adornments, these being changed pretty much every hour. Some of these painted depictions also became the objects of early photographic depictions, as did also a particular genre of devotional image known as a manurat. In these, the photographically tabooed Swarup appears in painted form, and the usually symmetrically positioned devotees and Goswamis, i.e. the priests, are frequently depicted photographically, i.e. as photographic heads, stuck onto the surface of the image. So this also occurs chromolithographically in a way that mimics photography. You can see on the left, image from Cancroli, and it also starts to inform a genre of purely chromolithographic devotional images. The Manorat established a template which is still in evidence as an actual and virtual infrastructure in Nathdwara photographic studios to this day, and which allows pilgrims to be photographed on either side of a painted image of the Swarup. And there are other regional traditions which, if we had time, I'd love to talk about, like Balaji in South India, the Shiv image, Mahakaleshwar Mandir in Ujjain in central India. It is tempting to say that the prototype for most images of deities are not the deities themselves, but their statues, their murtis, or in this case, swarups. But this would be to ignore the large number of early images which present deities on stage. It is easy to misrecognize the symmetrical framing above the deity, which you can see very clearly on the left. Ignore the mistransliteration of this as Ganga Devi. So it's easy to misrecognize a symmetrical framing above the deity as the arch of a temple, which is what we see on the right, in which a sculpture was placed. But research on the entanglement of popular mythological drama and the first mass-produced lithographs of deities revealed that they were frequently depicted as actors on a stage. This performative dimension was highly significant and revealed that deities were desired not so much for their form as for their actions. This narrative and performative actualization would also be powerfully evident in the late 1980s, when a set of visual prototypes from early print culture were reanimated televisually in Doordarshan, i.e. the state TV channels Ramayana and Mahabharata. But performance and narrative are not to be conceptualized as distinct zones. In India as elsewhere, they are intimately entangled, for statues as living deities require continual attendance to their complex needs. Perhaps the most elaborate example of this is the previously mentioned darshana, revelation and adornment, shingara, of the god Srinathji. These are visualized in some chromolithographs and are elaborately detailed on the website of the Srinathji Nathdwara Foundation. They are also a feature of lenticular prints, or rather we might say that lenticular photography helps return us to a temporal process which attaches to sculpture and which flat photography obliterated through its imprisonment in the instantaneous. But there are other ways of approaching this dynamic which take the sculptural not as a single entity in need of photographic translation, more or less perfectly achieved, but rather as a node or matrix of connections which ensnare other representational practices in its net. This would not be to deny that there are certain genres of photographic practice in India which attempt to deal with photography's two-dimensionality and deploy specific tactics to present something akin to volumetricity in photography. For instance, through double montage printing and here the use of mirrors, which allow us to see the back as well as the front that faces the camera. And also a much more widespread attempt in a whole range of Indian image practices to close the three-dimensional space between the viewer and the picture plane, rather than investing authority in the representational space behind the picture plane and a vanishing point, through, for instance, the application of zari, or adornment such as this. And other important genres of photography pose aspirant religious leaders as though they were already statues. And I'm just going to give you a quick visual sampling of the incredible density and richness of this cycle, this fluid interchange, this zone of translation in which human subjects become statues, are modeled on statues. So Shiv Parvati, within a shivling on the left, forming the template for a wedding photography. Lots of local shrines using photographic montage as part of their publicity machine to build up their cultic status. local gurus, aspirant gurus, who then assume the embodied persona of statues. This is one from my portfolio I'm trying to build up for my post-academic career plan. And then also lenticular prints, which particularly in the case of the Dalit leader Ambedkar, who converted to Buddhism, this is perhaps a nicer example, uses an image based on a photograph. So this is that famous image which shows Ambedkar in a blue suit as the student of John Dewey, the universal pragmatist, counterposed with that Buddhism which he embraces at the end of his life as an alternative to what he describes as the dung heap upon which Nehru has built his palace of independent India. Visual engagements with volumetricity take various forms. Most commonly, an architectural form becomes a locational frame for a god or goddess. So here, Meenakshi from Tamil Nadu in South India. So we have a link to architecture, and then that painted image, then montage with a photographic aerial backdrop. And in the case of Jyotirlingas, the multiplicity of incarnations of Shiv, a central lingam is connected homunculistically to a geographically dispersed set of iterations of the central image. They are all, in a sense, three-dimensional aspects of the image, which in its core form is necessarily compressed. This spectrum or lattice has unfolded in striking ways in recent years in the central Indian village, which I've worked intermittently since 1982. Even in rural India, during significant festivals, the cell phone camera is omnipresent, providing a photo and film stripe to recall Adorno's description of the ever-presence of radio in 1930s America. During Dol Gyaras, when dozens of junkies, divine tableau, are processed through the streets of the town of Nagda, a sea of mobile phones like lilting lilies mimics the mechanized dances of the divine automata on display. In Jain temples in the town, the older generation finds itself increasingly unable to have physical darshan or interaction with the Tirthankara because their children are so eager to snap images on their smartphones to distribute on WhatsApp. In the village of Batisura, during this year's Tejas Dasmi, the village-wide procession was extensively filmed and photographed, especially by the huge crowd of female onlookers who are not part of the performative excess involving dancing and gymnastics, which unfolds as the ever-growing body of those who have made a vow carry their cobra-adorned umbrellas towards the central Tedaji shrine. And before my final paragraph, a brief whiz through what one might think of as the media fold, this lattice, this circularity, this incredibly complex multi-directional street in which we see all these mutating translational forms. So the image we see at the center here in a village puja room purports to be an image captured on a mobile phone of a Panchmukhi Nag, a five-headed cobra, which was published in a newspaper. We'll see a refined image of that in a moment. That image relates to sculptural forms in the Tedaji shrine, which you can actually see out of the window of this puja room. It's immediately adjacent to it. So we have a mobile phone-generated image in conversation with a pre-existing archetype. The Panchmukhi Nag is obviously a very deeply rooted iconographic motif in the Indic tradition. This is from Sri Ranganaswamy Temple in Tiruchirappalli in Tamil Nadu in South India. So there is a visual template actualized through this mobile phone photograph, reproduced in a newspaper, copied and distributed as laminated prints by a local photographic studio, which then formed the basis for villagers to create a 30-foot-long canvas and straw murti of the Panchmukhi Nag, modelled on the photograph which you can see in front of that statue, that sculptural form, which in turn was then photographed by a local newspaper, which then doubtless was disseminated to other villages, which then followed their example. And currently, this image now circulates in this form, a much upgraded example of what villagers perceive to be the ways in which new techniques of mobile phone photography allows them to participate in what Ariella Azoulay calls the civil contract of photography. Their perception is that at last technology allows them to represent their disavowed worldview to the outside. So here is what Deleuze might have called a media fold, an origami-like compression in which inside and outside become difficult to distinguish, and volume and flatness are entangled in new ways. We might recall for a final time Oliver Wendell Holmes on the photographic negative, where, quote, extremes meet. It has gone round a complete circle and is at once as remote from nature and as near as possible, end quote. It is also a demonstration of the logic of that fluidarity which Makin Marriott sought to place at the centre of his Ethnosociology of India. This fluid, oscillating spectrum, fold or circle, which continually refigures the borders between photography and sculpture, is a striking space of exchange and translation. It is very different from the stable terrain predicted by the solidarities of official Western social theory and perhaps some kinds of art history. Thank you.
Sure. We have time for a question.
I'd have a question about the lenticular photographs, because I was really drawn to the way in which you're talking about how they enact a temporal process, which is something that's come up in several of the talks today. I have a very basic question about these. Can you talk a little bit more about how they're displayed or used, and what function they serve?
They're displayed like other framing prints in domestic contexts. And they require the devotee to move their head slightly to experience that central field of often quite tremendous depth, and then the two-in-one alteration. So their modality is, I would say, an intensification and an enhancement of a pre-existing image practice. So in this particular village, I happen to know because I once did a village-wide survey, there are an average of 16 images in each household, framed or laminated, but displayed in a puja room, often alongside, in a very kind of promiscuously intermedial setting, small three-dimensional sculptural forms. So in that sense, you could see it as a translational object that's mediating between the very flat chromolithograph, the conventional framing print, and those three-dimensional murtis, which conventionally would be placed along a shelf in front of the images. So you also have, there's a lot of other stuff there, like marigold garlands, incense sticks, little books of Sanskrit slokas, and so there's a whole range of equipment that surrounds these images. Thank you.
So thank you, Megan and Sarah, for your invitation. It's a real pleasure to be back here at the Getty and learn so much from all of you. Before I turn to the main topic of my paper, I just wanted to say a little bit about where my interest in this project is coming from, really the material. I'm at the very earliest stages of a new project that is looking at the conceptual category of the organic line. And this is a line of space that the Brazilian artist Ligia Clark observes in 1954 and starts to work with. And you can see it basically right here, right? So it's a line of space that occurs between, say, a painting and its frame, or between a door and a wall. And part of what I want to argue is that the organic line is a modernist device with very wide-ranging implications, and in this sense is as important as such paradigms as the ready-made or collage. It is very much unlike these other paradigms in the sense that it's relatively unknown outside of Brazilian art. So here, this very unresolved question of a global art history kind of pushes up against the disciplinary foundations of modernism. So in light of this essentially historiographic contradiction, what I'm interested in doing is not writing a history of the organic line in a sense of a genealogy of its influence, but rather treating it as a kind of conceptual category, a generative concept that allows me to move across chronologies and regions, and thus sort of disobey some of the conditions and disciplinary protocols that prevented the organic line from having more impact in its time. So many of you may know that there was an important Leisure Clark retrospective at MoMA this past summer, and one of the notable things about the exhibition is that it displayed replicas of Clark's bichos alongside originals within the main exhibition spaces. And so that's what you're seeing on the left. The bichos are these series of hinged metal sculptures that Clark began to make in 1960, and she intended them to be handled by their viewers because the forms respond to the movements. So in some ways we can think about how the organic line migrates to the sculpture in terms of these animating hinges. And you can see in this comparison that MoMA's 2014 approach is very, very different than the first time they displayed a bichot in 2004 when they reopened the new building, in which you have this plexiglass case around it and no indication that this was meant to be handled at all. One of the very interesting things that occurred in the recent retrospective was that it was usually the guards that encouraged visitors to touch the replicas of the bichos, explaining the work to the viewers, acting in essence as educators and facilitators. And in fact, the guards that volunteered to work in the exhibition participated in workshops and training concerning Clark's artistic trajectory. And this is actually relatively uncommon, at least at MoMA. So what I find significant here is that in unsettling the museum's behavioral protocols, allowing people to touch sculptures in essence, the bichos also set in motion a certain unsettling of its institutional hierarchies, that is, the way in which it organizes and administers different kinds of labor, specifically the intellectual labor of the curator or educator, and the embodied labor of the museum guard. The guard, of course, and not insignificantly, is located at the bottom of the museum's pay scale, and his or her responsibilities are usually disciplinary rather than expository in nature. They pertain to the material and legal security of the museum's objects, the former in terms of physical protection, the latter in terms of preventing copyright violations through unauthorized photographs, and the guard's embodied presence is central to both of these. In the Leisure Clark show, the activation and pressuring of these boundaries of labor and work resulted in a peculiar situation in which the guards were tasked with a double mantra of please touch on the one hand and no pictures please on the other. So what I'm interested in thinking about is this boundary or interface as a kind of institutional organic line that lies between the work and its framing construct of the museum. This is an organic line that is both disciplinary and destabilizing, regressive, and potentially emancipatory. It's also a line that's at the very limits of legibility. It's a byproduct of the exhibition rather than in its explicit content. In this liminality, however, it activates political and economic questions that go to the heart of what it means to display experimental art in the contemporary museum. So it's from this perspective that I'll now turn to Tino Sehgal and what I'm calling here the not photography of not sculpture. What can prohibition tell us about the photography of sculpture? Consider an unequivocally art historical work such as Kiss, 2003, by the British-born, Berlin-based artist Tino Sehgal. For this piece, a pair of hired dancers cycle through a series of positions drawn from well-known artworks on the theme, including sculptures by Canova, Rodin, and Brancusi. The resulting 8-minute choreography is then repeated, with male and female interpreters switching roles. At a designated point within the loop, the pair announce the work's artist, title, and date, each dancer verbalizing a single element before returning to their embrace. Kiss was among several works Sehgal exhibited at the Fondazione Nicola Trussardi in Milan in 2008. There, against the backdrop of the Villarreal's collection of neoclassical sculpture, it seemed to realize the Pygmalion myth of animating inert matter into life. In the sparse spaces of the Guggenheim, stripped entirely of any other works for Sehgal's This Is Progress in 2010, meanwhile, Kiss enacted the dynamics of absorption and theatricality key to Michael Fried's critique of minimalist sculpture. To a large degree, Kiss's citational quality, and more specifically its art historical legibility to an attentive viewer, depends upon the dissemination of sculpture in photographs and other reproductive media, as you see here. Sehgal himself famously prohibits photography of his work, however, which he terms neither sculptures nor performances, but constructed situations. Such constructed situations usually involve trained performers, interpreters within Sehgal's lexicon, who interact with the museum visitors according to a set of behavioral and linguistic prompts defined by the artist in advance. The injunction against documentation is in keeping with the apparent immateriality of this practice and extends to include the work's sale and transfer. These are accomplished as per the performative utterance in Austin's speech theory through oral contract alone. Sehgal's injunction maps, though not seamlessly or unproblematically, upon environmental concerns about sustainability and material overproduction. The artist disallows any physical imprint of his practice, insisting, for instance, that all press releases remain in digital form. Of course, the digital is hardly free of environmental or social concerns. The UN, for example, has described the mining of the metallic ore coltan, which is used extensively in laptops, phones, and any other electronic device in which one might receive this immaterial press release, as the engine of the armed conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And these are images from a film made by Steve McQueen in 2007, Gravesend, in which he traces the mining of this ore and through to its industrial processing. Nevertheless, Sehgal's embrace of immateriality carries with it a certain asceticism, appealing in a world cluttered with manufactured things. Embedded within this ecological position, moreover, is a far more ambitious claim about the historical obsolescence of materialist modes of production. Whereas the vast majority of contemporary art continues to depend upon a transformation of material substrates, Sehgal argues, his simultaneous process of realization and derealization provides, quote, a paradigm for another mode of production, as he puts it. This other mode, in fact, corresponds to the contemporary service economy, an economy that trades in affects and immaterial products, and, as Sehgal's work demonstrates, is equally conducive to the commodification of art. And it's important to note here that Sehgal does not argue with the commodification of art or the art market, the market economy, but rather the materiality of production as such. As Claire Bishop has observed, Sehgal's prescription against photography and documentation is an efficient publicity tool, generating discourse and desire in equal parts. The verbal and written descriptions that emanate from the work's empty center are therefore not the weakest link in Sehgal's conceptual fortress, as Bishop writes, but rather are immanent to the work, a production that stands for and encircles the objective of his practice. Moreover, as one might imagine, photographs of Sehgal works do indeed circulate. In 2010, the New York Times published illicit iPhone images for the review of Sehgal's Kiss, and This Is Progress at the Guggenheim over protests by the artists in the museum. A simple Google search or a Flickr search will likewise generate scores of images. Some observers, meanwhile, seem to be dedicated explicitly to violating Sehgal's ban, as we see here in an editorial for the online art night magazine called Photos for Tino, or this article on the right by Marcella Lacube, a disgruntled French interpreter who appeared in Sehgal's This Situation at the Centre Pompidou. A more interesting line of critique is suggested by works such as You Call This Progress by the collaborative duo Gerard and Ryan, who choreographed it in response to the explicitly heteronormative scoring of Sehgal's Kiss. The two learned the piece by visiting the Guggenheim over the course of several days and recording their own verbal account of the movements with their cell phones. In the resulting work, a same-sex couple and a trio substitute the male-female pair of Sehgal's work. And what I'm showing you here is an image from a related video installation that Gerard and Ryan made called Kiss Solo, and it's actually in the collection of the Hammer Museum. And I'll just play a little excerpt from it here. And basically what you have is a single dancer sort of inhabiting both roles and responding to their own voice, narrating the choreography.
His left knee on small of back, her left knee on his small of back. He wipes her back with his hands. Her right hand caresses his left chest. They are swaying back and forth like a dance, still kissing.
They continue rolling to the left. She rolls away from him, striding for his thigh. She writhes on her back.
He gazes from left shoulder back across the room to look out over her. They're reversing roles, but they're also reversing direction. And then he looks down to see her again. His right hand caresses her over her breast.
He's right, spirals, pressing into his left foot, right foot. He bridges up and then sinks again into her pelvis. She has both of her legs extended. She's sitting on her butt. He's sitting on her left. He organizes his pelvis between her legs, and they still pressing. Draws his knees to the right. But then he presses again, right, left, arches up. They both look away.
There's some sort of caressing going on. This is the crotch moment. Right hand caresses the inside of the left thigh, knee to crotch. I think he's cleaning up her crotch. And he looks her up.
So he's sitting on his knees. She's sitting.
That's the closest we'll get to seeing Sehgal's kiss here. What I find interesting about the development of this critique as a kind of artistic practice is that the artist violated Sehgal's ban on documentary reproduction in order to highlight the behavioral reproduction of normative gender roles, which is, of course, precisely the site where Judith Butler locates the disciplinary character of the performative. And these artists are essentially turning that repetition on its head to use reproduction as a conceptual generator within the work. Now, to return to Sehgal, in actively seeking to prevent the proliferation of photographic images of his works but accepting the prohibition's ample discursive fruits, Sehgal benefits from the mechanisms of a spectacular exhibitionary culture while remaining aloof from its symptomatic visuality. Compare this strategy, for example, with Marina Abramovich's highly documented performance for her 2010 MoMA retrospective, The Artist is Present. For this durational piece, which continued for the entire length of the show, Abramovich invited members of the public to individually sit with her in the museum's atrium for as long as they could manage the intensity of her gaze. Here, the artist internalized the relationship between photography and performance. She provided the technological conditions for good photographs to be taken in this elaborate stagecraft that you see. She orchestrated these uniquely photogenic moments, this content. She arranged this content even according to a schematic photographic frame. But most importantly, she invited visitors to co-inhabit a durational present with her as their performances were documented in turn. Abramovich has frequently remarked, "If you give me your time, I'll give you experience." The photographic portraits of each visitor who sat with Abramovich over the 3 months of her exhibition, which are now archived on MoMA's website, are proof of this experience. But we have to recognize that they are also that experience's aim. For the artist is present, in some very literal sense, was a performance of the photographic moment. Its punctum, nothing less than the presumed indexical authenticity of experience itself. And I learned in doing this presentation that a very popular Google image search is Marina Abramovich, The Artist is Present, Visitors Crying. That gives you a little sense of that. Tino Sehgal, by contrast, rejects both the terms performance and photography in order to position his work within a purely intangible, ephemeral realm of experience, one unmarred, for instance, by the simulacral relations Guy Debord and the Situationist wrote of, and to which Sehgal's own terminology of a constructed situation is clearly indebted. Sehgal's works, like Abramovich's, are intended to deliver experience to their viewers in and through time. But Sehgal wants his works to function as objects more so than events. And here we might point to the constant rather than episodic nature of their public presentation, the conventions that guide the sale and transfer of the works, the fact that each situation is editioned, usually 5 with 2 artist proofs, and so on. In this strategic embrace of objecthood, Sehgal aligns his practice not with dance and performance, which were his own background, but sculpture, a medium that makes privileged historical claims on the spaces and institutional logic of the museum. It is by disrupting these medial expectations that Sehgal's work seems most radical. For while no choreographer would consider the bodies of his or her dancers dematerialized, visitors come to the museum primarily for an encounter with inanimate physical things. KISS is instrumental, indeed intentionally instructional in this regard, for while it depends upon the distinct training and skills of a dancer's body, its catalog of citations self-consciously locates the work within an art historical lineage of objects. Indeed, while Sehgal has claimed copyright violation when images of his works are recorded or reproduced, it is debatable whether he holds copyright at all. Under international intellectual property laws, works of performance can only be copyrighted when fixed in a material form, such as photography and film. This actually varies by country, but the standard international intellectual copyright law requires this fixture, this element of fixture. The fact remains that Sehgal's copyright claims and his elective affinity to certain mediums over others are rhetorical rather than legalistic in scope. Approached from this perspective, it is precisely the interdiction against photography that transforms the performance of sculpture in a work such as KISS into a constructed situation. Preventing photography, in short, demarcates the work's internal boundaries, its conceptual coherence as a radically immaterial object of art. But what if, instead of focusing on the internal boundaries of Sehgal's works, we were to probe their external boundaries? And here I return to the lesson of Leisha Clark's organic line. For if the organic line is an unmade line that lies between a work and its frame, it has both an internal limit, which defines what we could conventionally describe as the work's composition or content, but also an external limit, which is where the spatial boundary interfaces with the material resistance of the frame. We are, of course, familiar, perhaps too familiar, with the ways practices grouped under the rubric of institutional critique shifted the focus from work to frame, as Craig Owen succinctly put it. But the organic line suggests that between work and frame is an unmade interval that rubs up against the coherence of both. For Sehgal's work, I'd like to suggest this interval is precisely where prohibition, experience, and presence turn over into proliferation, representation, and supplementarity. My conclusions here are preliminary, but I want to suggest 2 linked problematics that perhaps we can further explore in discussion. The first concerns the relationship between form and content, or put another way, the problem of how we can approach social sculpture in the round, as it were. And here I'm using the term social sculpture to describe Sehgal's constructed situations, not necessarily to link it to a Boysian genealogy. Joseph Beuys was the one who termed this, who coined this term social sculpture, but as a way of underscoring the formal elements of works we might otherwise describe as social practice or relational aesthetics. Using the term sculpture for me is a way of homing in on the structure, composition, and plasticity of a given work and the way these elements function within a space of encounter. If in an excessively mediated society, the prohibition of photography functions to establish the contours of a constructed situation by means of a set of institutional and ethical protocols, the rules or script that govern such a work likewise establish its shape from within. In November of last year, Princeton University commissioned a week-long version of Sehgal's This Situation for a studio space in the university's Visual Arts Center. The work had premiered at Marion Goodman Gallery in 2007, and the Princeton version was the first time it was shown outside a museum or gallery context. A university seemed a particularly appropriate environment for the piece, as its content consists of stylized salon conversations elaborated by 6 interpreters who also interact with the public. These conversations are prompted by a series of historical quotes concerning such topics as the economy, aesthetic pleasure, comportment, the nature of work, and so on. My thoughts on the piece are informed by my experience as a visitor over the course of several afternoons and my overlapping role as a professor in the same institution. And at the top is the studio space in the Visual Arts Center where the piece was staged. And this is just the room that I happen to teach in most of the time. Locating this situation within a university posed the work as a kind of alternative pedagogy, one in which the various hierarchies that define academic institutions might be leveled or even overturned. For me, experiencing this work, 2 theoretical models seem particularly resonant. The first is Jacques Rancière's discussion in his book, The Ignorant Schoolmaster, of the educator Jean-Joseph Jacotot, who at the turn of the 19th century advocated for a radical equality of intelligences. Jacotot's method depended on what we might describe as a kind of absolute object, a book in this instance, that lies between the schoolmaster and the student and renders them equal from the beginning of the process. The second model is Hannah Arendt's description of a space of appearance in the human condition. This is a kind of transitory public that is constituted by people acting and speaking together. What interests me about Arendt's formulation is that she conceives of this space in terms of togetherness but also apartness. She gives the metaphor of a table that stands between subjects, but in so doing also provides a locus or forum around which they might gather. As an art historian, a teacher, a student, I've always thought of the work of art as this table, this book, which establishes both a separateness and a kind of shared, invested equality for its observers. The question, at least posed for me, in experiencing Sehgal's this situation, is what is this absolute object? For while the work would seem to posit a space of appearance in its temporary staging of a discursive commons, it is a space that does not tolerate discussions of the work of art as a form. This is doubly significant as the piece is structured according to a rigorous, though flexible set of rules that are largely discernible to an attentive viewer. Each new visitor who enters the room prompts the collective utterance, "Welcome to this situation," and it's drawn out in this manner to indicate that kind of verbalization is the content. This is followed by physical circulation of the interpreters around the room until each settles into a pose often drawn like kiss from well-known works of art. One interpreter offers up a rehearsed but unattributed citation to which others respond while moving in continuous slow motion, occasionally drawing visitors into the conversation with the query, "What do you think?" Despite the deliberate artifice of this formal structure, the piece deflects all attempts to mediate on the didactic this of this situation. Efforts to pressure the work's rules or turn conversation to the piece itself are met with various strategies of benevolent reabsorption and containment. The most extreme is a non sequitur in which an interpreter remarks on a visitor's clothing in such a manner that the very surface of a sartorial detail serves as a bridge back to the previous discussion. The effect is to sidestep indexical self-reflection on the piece as an aesthetic construct in an expanded sense, in order to reinscribe indexical co-presence by means of aesthetic contemplation in the most traditional of senses. Often it is the offending visitor, him or herself, to whom the aesthetic commentary is directed, as I found out. The eruption compels you to observe the work's boundaries. It teaches you how to be appropriate to it. It shunts off your vulgarity and indecorousness. It gently implores you to play by its rules. This is part of the piece's charm and generosity, but also its policing and control. In 2004, Kevin Roberts, the CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi Advertising, suggested that the next step in the evolution of brands is the love mark, a brand whose claim on the consumer surpasses the old traits of loyalty or rationality and is primarily affective and emotional in its charge. Love marks are uniquely geared towards what sociologists call voicey consumers, consumers that actively participate in the qualifying of branded goods. Voicey consumers creatively engage in personalizing the meanings and associations of commodities, but in so doing potentially destabilize qualities constructed for a given product by its brand. Brands aspiring to be love marks, Robert writes, must therefore develop intuitive listening skills and ways to harvest stories of their consumer experiences. In this way, as the anthropologist Robert Foster has observed, agency and innovation are anticipated and guided, contained within the parameters of a brand's identity. Consumer overflowings are welcome to the extent that they develop the brand in certain directions, but unwelcome to the extent that they exceed the frames of permissible or manageable use. It is not difficult to see that Sehgal's constructed situations operate in much a similar manner. They encourage, indeed depend on our participation in emotional investment. By bringing voicey consumers such as myself back into the fold by means of content, however, Sehgal's constructed situations actively resist being approached as social sculptures in the round. In so doing, they suppress the organic line that lies between the work and its institutional frames. This brings me to my final point, which circles back to labor, embodied labor in particular. For Sehgal's works can only be considered immaterial if we ignore the materiality of the bodies that perform and protect them. In Princeton's version of this situation, these bodies often overlapped with those of professors and students, and much of the pleasure of inhabiting and viewing the work derived from the defamiliarization of these roles. Mathieu Pot-Bonneville, a philosopher who appeared in the work when it was installed in Paris, describes this interest as, quote, the opening up of a space where it was possible to remain anonymous, of experiencing oneself as a talking body because there was no longer an obligation to speak in one's own name. Such moments were possible, he continues, only because the speech there was nobody's speech, because the source of language was occupied only by players who could be replaced, and because the only name, the artist, designated an absence, end quote. What Pot-Bonneville describes here is nothing less than the affective charge of Foucault's author function. Yet what would it mean to inhabit such a replaceable space when it coincides with labor stripped of symbolic capital, labor that is replaceable precisely because it is embodied, yet paradoxically invisible in relationship to the work? Sehgal gestures to this question in works such as This is Propaganda and This is So Contemporary. These are two different works, the first from 2002, This is So Contemporary from 2005, in which museum guards, the very workers tasked with policing the prohibition of photography, appear to act as interpreters of the piece. In these works, guards suddenly break into song or dance, verbalizing the work's artist, title, and year before returning to the pacing, leaning, standing, and surveying that constitute the usual gestures of the job. The eruption of this unusual repertoire of behaviors is startling for an unsuspecting visitor. It renders the guards' presence hyper-visible, mapping their physical labor upon the immaterial work of art. In this process, two of the key methods by which Sehgal establishes a constructed situation's conceptual coherence, the ban on photographic reproduction and the piece's score or rules, suddenly converge. But here, a peculiar elision occurs, for these pieces primarily employ actors representing museum guards rather than security employees of the actual institution. This fiction has little effect on the visitor's experience since they are unlikely to know. But in mimetically representing the embodied labor of the museum guard, pieces such as This is So Contemporary radically dematerialize this labor, transforming its actual protagonists into simulacral representations of labor internal to the work of art. It is therefore both conceptually appropriate and deeply disturbing that these interpreters also enforce the prohibition of photography. For if Sehgal's immaterial situations reject the extractive logic of material production and the supplementarity of photographic reproduction, these doubled and absented museum guards internalize both. The precarity of labor to which this condition speaks is not alien to the halls of academia, although its symptoms present in markedly different form. For Sehgal's this situation offers the intellectual frisson of an assigned and assignable space with an embodied social sculpture, the corporatization of the 21st century university also encourages us to make ourselves over into immaterial brands. This is so contemporary, but we can hope it will not always be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. We have time for some questions.
Thanks. I had one question, which was that one of the other terms that Sehgal frequently uses for his work, other than constructed situations, are commodities without objects. Mm-hmm. And so I wondered how that fits into the two halves of what you were describing, and also under that context, whether they make sense as sculptures.
Well, I think the rhetorical power of claiming that these things are immaterial objects is very important. So when he says commodities without objects, he's really talking about commodities without physical objects. But he wants very much to maintain this notion that the work of art has this kind of discreteness, that has an object-like form in all of the senses in which it circulates within the economy of the art world. So the way in which it's transferred from an owner to another, the way it's acquired by a museum. There are many other ways that one can imagine the kind of the purchasing of such a work of art. And for example, in performance, purchasing, commissioning would work in a very different way. But he wants to hold on to this notion of the object. So I actually haven't come across interviews, again, I'm just sort of starting this, I haven't come across as many interviews, or I'm trying to think of much of any where he talks about commodities without objects. And it might be a kind of earlier moment. There was a moment, I think, when he was describing things as situations rather than constructed situations. But he seems to be kind of acquiring a sort of a lexicon to increasingly describe these works within the terms that he wants them to circulate in the art world. I'm not sure if that helps you much. Thanks. I'll think about it some more.
Thank you. I think I heard you make a distinction in his work between form versus a kind of, you said a rigorous though flexible set of rules. And I was wondering if you could just go into more detail about why a rigorous structured set of rules doesn't constitute a form.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I understand it is the set of rules are a kind of structure that determines the form. But when I'm sort of thinking about form, and the reason that I wanted to use the term social sculpture is that I want to think about the form as the place where the coherence that is produced by that set of rules, that structure, comes up against an external environment, which we understand to be the space of encounter. So that's sort of how I'm understanding it right now. Thanks.
One more quick question. Yes.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Irene, for your great presentation. I'm very interested in the subject matter. How you said you just got started on this. How can we keep up with you, keep abreast of what you're doing? Is there any way you will post your upcoming information, or?
Wait, Tina Sehgal's?
Well, of your information of what you said you just started.
Oh, this project?
Yes. Is there anything more you're going to be doing to the project?
I have nothing. This is it.
Okay, that's it. Okay. Thanks.
Keep tuned.
I'd like to add my thanks to the long list of thanks to Megan and Sarah, and also to the Getty for this invitation and the occasion. In my paper, it's called Evidence of Sculpture, and it's divided into 4 sections. 1. The work untitled To Henri Matisse by Dan Flavin consists of 4 vertically positioned 8-foot fluorescent lamps arranged from left to right according to the following color sequence: pink, yellow, blue, green. It was conceived as such by Flavin in 1964, fabricated by his wife Sonia, and shown that year in a group exhibition at the Green Gallery in New York. I'm showing it to you here in a digital image that was shot in 2003 for the Catalogue Raisonné of Flavin's work. The image was produced by the Dia Foundation in a designated space where a number of the works were installed specifically in order to create new photography using consistent conditions of lighting and space and digital manipulation all devised to correct for the extreme variability that characterized photography of Flavin's work in the past. Almost everything I've just said about Untitled to Henri Matisse signifies a contingency of one kind or another. The work was conceived and first fabricated in 1964, but the object you see in this image was newly fabricated in order to be shot in 2003. It is an exhibition copy that, once shot, was to be destroyed. That's to say that, given the terms of Flavin's work overall, along with a good deal of work by other artists of the period of so-called minimal art, conception, production, and display don't necessarily coincide. In Flavin's case, the object could be described as being secondary to the optical phenomenon of colored light produced by the lamp. This was Flavin's own claim, and with that in mind, he rejected the designation sculpture for his work. In any case, as some early critics remarked, optically speaking, the light, which can be hard to stare at, obliterates the fixture. But early statements by the artist show that the shape of the lamp and the low-tech nature of the hardware clearly mattered to him. There as well, he referred to the lamp with deliberate ambiguity as an object image. Either way, these objects were made according to criteria that were adjusted over time. Studio assistants who came to execute all fabrications of his work explained that, beginning in the 1970s, Flavin sought a cleaner, less intrusive presence for the hardware. Eventually, the artist would insist that early fabrications be replaced by new ones. In this regard, one can find oneself, as we do at the Guggenheim Museum, possessing two versions of the same work, one early and one late, which are quite, believe it or not, quite different from one another, yet equally viable. The concrete object, the fixture, which consists of the pan and wiring and other hardware, merely serves to support the lamp, the fluorescent tube. Yet in Flavin's lifetime, the fluorescent lighting industry itself changed, so even the lamps themselves, the tubes, cannot be addressed as a constant. One question these factors raise in presenting, perpetuating, and interpreting Flavin's work is whether or not the historicity of the object or of the medium should matter. In any case, as evidence, the photographic record reveals, among many other things, the changing nature of the work as object across a range of multiple iterations, the kind of thing Flavin, who considered his work largely ahistorical, was apparently trying to erase. The presumed lack of priority among various versions of a work can be ascribed to the proto-conceptualist nature of some qualities of minimal art, according to which the object possesses few of the aesthetic values that attend most previous forms of sculpture making. Standardized materials and uninflected surfaces of commercial manufacture substitute for the art mediums and the conventions of authenticity associated with signs of an authorial hand. In a manner of speaking, we are, then, to separate the work, the conception of it as 4 8-foot side-by-side fluorescent lamps in pink, yellow, blue, and green, from the object, which got made, discarded, and remade or duplicated over time. Moreover, regardless of what we say about historicity or the primacy of the light, the status of the object as something that is constructed and then mounted on the wall and under a variety of conditions from one place to another and mounted on the wall under a variety of conditions from one place to another, influences the identity of the work. This can be demonstrated by an image of Untitled to Henri Matisse on the cover of Arts magazine in January 1970, where it appears unlit and uncharacteristically floating in the center of a wall, with no apparent relation to the floor. Most significant, here the object is also reproduced in reverse. That is, somewhere in the course of the production of the magazine cover, the photograph was either inverted or flopped, so that the colors read in sequence not pink, yellow, blue, green, but green, blue, yellow, pink. In this case, the properties of the photographic image establish an unusual risk, reversal or inversion of a work that is premised on modular repetition can occur simply through inadvertent mishandling of the image, yet remain unobserved by anyone who doesn't know the work well enough to detect the change. And in 1970, that group surely included most readers of Arts magazine. It's the character of the work as object that lends itself to this kind of intervention on the part of the camera. With these factors in mind, We can then match the simultaneous coexistence of the two viable iterations with different dates at the Guggenheim and the inverted or flopped photographic image of a single iteration of the work on the cover of Arts magazine to a third instance of the object's susceptibility to risk, which shows up when it was installed by the collector Giuseppe Panza, who owned it, in a show of Panza's collection at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid in 1988. There, the prescribed color sequence was wholly ignored. Indeed, one color was even altered. As you see here, the work was shown in Madrid, not as pink, yellow, blue, green, but as yellow, pink, blue, red. This change, be it a mistake or a deliberate alteration, would have been made by Panza himself or by the curator or installer in Madrid. It's important to know in this case that while Panza apparently did acquire Untitled to Henri Matisse from Flavin through the Gallery Sperone in Turin as an already fabricated work, for the Reina Sofia exhibition, he chose to authorize an exhibition copy rather than ship the existing object from Milan to Madrid, and he did so without Flavin's knowledge. Again, the significance of the camera concerns not just the transmission of the work as object, but the object's very status. In this regard, the function of the photographic record overall, as a record or descriptive account, is constitutive. Those conditions represented by the camera's terms are ones that, speaking of the historiography of minimal art, we generally disregard. A photograph is overexposed or underexposed, badly colored, cropped or framed, mechanically reproducible yet iterative, or subject to variation and given even to reversibility, apparently situational with respect to the fact that it records an object seen in a particular place, yet through vantage, exposure, and darkroom procedure, susceptible to many forms of manipulation. These visual and material peculiarities of photographic representation closely correspond to the shifting conditions in terms of the sculptural object it depicts with the advent of minimal art. 2. Photographic context sheets containing several dozen images of objects fabricated by Robert Morris between 1961 and 1963 show the objects in the space of the artist's early loft studios in Lower Manhattan. The photographs were taken at the behest of Morris by a friend, the photographer Mark Hedden, and were produced for the purposes of inventory. Morris was compiling an album of 8x10 images in order to show his work to various galleries. The photographs contain a lot of information, and for today, I primarily want to emphasize that while some of them show objects familiar to historians of this period of work, others show objects that were realized at the time but not saved. As specific objects, these are unfamiliar to the history of Morris's work as it is told in the literature. Although in their proportions and their medium, pine or painted plywood, they clearly correspond to other large constructed objects that were shown and that appeared in the art press and have been perpetuated in the critical literature since the 60s. In fact, such as this, most of the early objects by Morris that show up in exhibition photographs throughout the 60s no longer exist. The conditions of their production are as follows, and this account is based on exchanges with the artist. Until the late 60s, Morris constructed the objects in pine and plywood himself. They were largely derived from ideas that appear in notebook sketches. Many of them were produced on the occasion of shows, although a handful were fabricated for their own sake as works and represent examples of a typology of box-like forms that was of interest to the artist at the time. These objects were only preserved if they were sold, a rare occurrence. Otherwise, they were dismantled. Morris explains that he moved studios several times during this period, and dragging these things from one location to another was out of the question. In any case, preserving them was deemed unnecessary. Indeed, the works he built for his landmark plywood exhibition at the Green Gallery, which I'm showing you here in 1964, were all fabricated at the gallery and then discarded after the closing of the show. As for the objects in the photographs, some were built, then rejected. While Morris lived in one place, the raw materials of one object were, as he puts it, recycled back into the fabrication of others. Once it came time to move, the constructions were dismantled and their component parts were left behind intact or consigned to the trash. It's generally said that these objects as sculpture were produced to address perceptual and physical considerations of wholeness and scale in relation to the body of the artist or beholder and to the space of a room. Some of them were even props and performances in collaboration with the dancers Simone Forti and Yvonne Rainer. In the context of such an exercise, then, one version of a work is just as good as another. Morris possessed sound basic carpentry skills, and he used them to fabricate the works with little attention to the refinements of craft. In this regard, the works are often thought of as quasi-propositional, and beyond fulfilling a few key criteria, the precise nature of the object in this context is largely said to be without importance. The object is, so to speak, indifferent. A further historical register exists, however, one that concerns the identity of the object as non-specific. Among other things, these constructions may be quasi-propositional, but they aren't just provisional. They weren't easy to make, and the early examples that we still have show signs of that. Morris's choice of materials was deliberate, and it changed during the 60s from plywood to fiberglass, and various versions can conspicuously differ from one another. To what extent, then, is the photographic record taken for granted as evidence when we write the history of minimal art? And these are 4 versions of a work called Corner Piece, produced in various materials across various states, by which time Morris delegated their fabrication to others. They're all dated 1964, however, by the artist. The record's function as a form of inventory is largely met with critical disregard, even though it's surely an index of the ontology of the minimalist object, its identity as concrete or literal, yet variable, given that it can be collapsed, adapted, reproduced, multiplied, or replaced, as well as badly made. See the lower right. In turn, the photographic record introduces a temporal dimension of minimal art, one that does not concern the durational experience of viewing a single minimalist object, which has long been a topic of critical scrutiny, but concerns instead a situation according to which the work may be a stable referent, while the multiplicity of objects, of variants, iterations, or copies shows it to be subject to a history of material transmutation. We typically identify change in minimalism with the work's identity as situational, according to which the reciprocal relation of the object to space and conditions of beholding changes from place to place. But change could also be said to pertain to the role of the work as the object's referent in interrogating specificity, testing whether or not consistent material specificity matters to the object's identity as sculpture versus its function as a proposition, according to which material specificity is said to be of little concern. Paying close attention to the circumstances of fabrication could risk fetishizing the material nature of the work, allowing the differences between versions to cloud or our vision of the object's primary function, its relation to a given space. But in a second register, a second history of minimalist art, the conditions of making could suggest that multiple variants of a given work are more than merely interchangeable ciphers for a single idea that the object is made to support in the context of beholding. Such a second history would instead invite a critical representation of the minimalist object as belonging to a perpetual series wherein one version or example serves to instigate a momentary encounter with the temporality of the series overall. To be sure, to say, as Morris does, that there is no original may simply mean that the work is adequately represented by any given variant from one place to the next. Yet it may also, or alternatively, mean that among its other functions, the minimalist object interrogates the very problematic of original and copy, if not presence and loss. With reference to Morris's photo book, for which the photographic proof sheets were made, the camera can be said from the start to have supported the scrutiny of iteration as a concept, in that the contact sheets represent an inventory of objects that now only exist in the form of a photographic image. Were one of the works in the photos to be reconstituted now as a newly made object, in which of the two forms it takes, old photographic image or newly fabricated object, would a value such as historical authenticity be said to reside? At what point along a scale of old versus new does the difference between an early object and a later one matter? Are we to square critical or historical claims for an early object based on our encounter with a later one, with claims of this kind based instead on the evidence of the early or original image, which we are apt to value in our search for the real thing? Perhaps instead the variability of the object turns out to be a fundamental principle of the status of the work. Carl Andre's equivalents 1 through 8 was shown at the Tibor Dinaj Gallery in New York in March 1966. The installation contains 8 works, each one a 2-tiered rectangular configuration consisting of 120 lime bricks, the same quantity of bricks for each of the forms. That's to say that while each configuration is identical as an individual work, the identical number of bricks in each one makes the 8 forms function together as a single installation, a kind of 9th work, composed of 8 parts that interrelate as a single permutational scheme. There are only a handful of photographs of this installation, each of which shows the photographer struggling with the distortions of the lens in attempting to capture the entirety of the work and its relation to the whole room. Equivalence is floor-bound, an early example of the radical horizontality of most of Andre's subsequent work, which occupies the actual and perceptual zone of the floor, thereby demanding a lowered gaze. The equivalents were named for a series of over 200 photographs of clouds by Alfred Stieglitz, which bear that title. James Meyer implies, from a conversation with the artist, that Andre adapted the title as a reference to the equivalence that exists among the 8 works, each one distinct, yet each containing the same number of bricks. Accordingly, it is the permuting nature of equivalence that must have been important to Andre, just as Stieglitz had, Meyer writes, conceived his series as a permutation set of related images. It must be said, however, that this is not what Stieglitz meant by the term equivalent, which was for him a reference to the presumed equivalency between an image from nature, an image in this case of a cloud, with a state of human emotion or a state of soul. Needless to say, whatever Andre meant by the term equivalence, it has nothing to do with psyche or soul. I would add that the cloud photographs are not typological and therefore not really given to equivalence in the sense of permutation either. A third form of equivalency may be in play. Given the rather striking designation of a photographic referent, we might look for help to the photographer and filmmaker Hollis Frampton. Andre's close relationship with Frampton, with whom he had composed the 12 dialogues, a series of exchanges in 1962-63 that were later published, tells us that Frampton was probably a resource for information and historical debate regarding photographic practice. Certain aspects of the cloud, according to Stieglitz's own terms, make it in a photograph both recognizable and abstract, is the word he used. As such, given the nature of Andre's installation, perhaps the primary element of correspondence between the photograph and the installation is not that of seriality, but of orientation. With the equivalents distributed as its components were across the floor of the room, no single vantage prevails. We walk around and through the configuration of 8 works, and of course, given Andre's radical leveling of the sculptural object, we look down. What in this context of the Stieglitz cloud? When observing the sky, it is difficult to identify a direction that could be called correct. Indeed, Stieglitz's act of looking up redirects the conventional orientation of the body and the gaze in the pictorial observation of nature. The significance of the element of orientation for Stieglitz is amplified by the way in which the photographs themselves were handled by him, in that he subjected some of the individual images to a process of rotation through which he chose to exhibit and reproduce certain cloud photos in more than one direction. Looking up in the Stieglitz equivalent is reciprocated in Andre's equivalents 1 through 8 by the act of looking down. This idea of changing orientation attributes instability to the sculptural object, one that also distinguishes the cloud itself as a natural phenomenon, as an example of perpetual change in nature that has, since antiquity, made the cloud a chief example of formlessness. The peculiar choice of a formless object with respect to the neutral or non-hierarchical but strictly configured, gridded formation of Andre's bricks is meaningful. It's often said by the artist himself and by his critical observers that the parts of any given work by Andre are identical in material and form and therefore interchangeable. These elements or particles possess no hierarchy amongst themselves. They were brought together for the purpose of installing a work, which is almost always configured as a grid or a column or row, but while they touch one another, they remain unattached. And here I'm showing you an example of a work order for metal plates. The medium was in part chosen for its specific material properties, but in their size and weight, the individual elements are also portable. Their dimensions are determined by a criterion of manageability, such that the artist or any one person could assemble a work on his own. Once the period of exhibition is over, the elements of the work were disassembled, stacked, and stored, or returned to the supplier from whence they came. This is what happened to André's equivalents. One of the works, equivalent 8, was sold out of the show to the Tate. The rest no longer exist as objects dating to 1966. I take the cloud with its implication of formlessness to signify the impermanence of the object, which comes together for an exhibition and then comes apart. The reciprocity of vantage, of up and down, and of integrity or coherence, of form and formlessness, allows that the equivalency at stake in André's installation amounts to a correspondence through the cloud as a mediating device of sculpture to photograph. The quality of integration and disintegration was a recurring motif in early writing about André's work, including some of his own statements, where he identifies the term clastic, derived from the Greek for broken, to describe the composition of his work from particles or interchangeable unattached parts. Physical integrity is also denoted by repeated references to the frequency with which a given work, once deinstalled, is likely to be decommissioned. Again, returned to the original supplier as raw material or surplus as so many bricks or plates. The parts, Dan Graham wrote in 1967, are perhaps put to an entirely non-related use as part of a different whole in a different future, unquote. In the case of André's early work, his work of the early 60s, Frampton tells us that he was called on by the artist to act as archivist, to shoot images of each small work, carved and found objects of various kinds, which, due to financial straits and repeated relocation from one derelict studio to another, were discarded, never having been made with the expectation of being saved. These circumstances held for some years. Frampton refers to the body of small objects as being an endless flow, quote, an endless flow of lost sculptures, unquote. Four, when the artist and critic Mel Bochner set out to review the primary structures exhibition at the Jewish Museum, which appeared there in spring 1966, just 1 month after the André equivalent show, he asked the museum for a press photo of a work of André's, also composed of arranged bricks, called Lever, and was told that no such photo exists. The work had struck Bochner as a significant demystification of artistic labor, and wanting to refer to it in his text, he convinced the curator to have this image shot for the review. The episode may be a minor one, but it demonstrates the evidential circumstances of the minimalist object or pseudo-object. Lever, like all of André's work, as Graham and other critics were at pains to note, ceased to exist as a work per se once it was deinstalled. Without Bochner's request, we'd have no record of the work in this form. The episode of the press photo is also useful in that it involves an artist who, like Graham, was also a writer and whose various texts during the 1960s represent, among other things, a chronicle of exhibition activity. In certain respects, Bochner's own artistic practice, which we familiarly refer to as conceptualist, at this very moment draws its investigation of systems of permutation and serial progression directly from principles available to him in the work of Flavin and André, among others. Both his writing and his other work in 1966, which took the form of drawing and some object making, represent an interrogation of minimalist art making. The art and the writing can be said together to form a single critical practice. It's with this in mind that I want to close by acknowledging Bochner's work called 36 Photographs and 12 Diagrams. There's no time today to carefully describe the work in full. It's enough to account, I think, for the basic elements. The photographs in question show changing configurations of the same group of 2-inch wooden cubes. Each configuration, which occupies a grid of 7 units on each side, was shot by a photographer not by the artist, from three vantages: overhead or plan view, an elevation, and an oblique three-quarters view. The diagrams represent these configurations mapped onto a drawing of the grid with inscribed numerals designating the number of stacked blocks from 0 through 4 that reside in each of the grid's 49 squares. As Scott Rothkopf has described at length, for Bochner, this work came to concern the camera itself as a flawed recording device in the context of the presumed literalism of minimalist sculpture. Absent any real measure of scale and given the distortions of the lens with respect to the representation of rectilinearity within the photographic frame, the putative objectivity of the camera collides with and perhaps belies the vaunted objectivity of minimal art. Yet in 36 photographs and 12 diagrams, which also dates to 1966, yet the work originated with the artist's search for the solution to a specifically sculptural problem. In the work, Bochner had been experimenting for some months with object making and had the wooden cubes cut in order to explore a process in which the configurations would change according to a permutational scheme like the one that occurs in the final work. Given an opportunity by Virginia Dwan to participate in an exhibition at her gallery for which the work would have been an especially good match, Bochner found himself faced with the fact that the premise of the piece was incompatible with the normal conditions for a show. The work consisted of changing configurations of a single set of blocks, which meant that only one iteration exists at any given time. How could visitors to the exhibition be expected to know this? Bochner's recourse to photography in order to preserve each one was motivated by the exhibition, for which he abandoned showing the wooden cubes. Subsequent to this project, he also abandoned object making in general in his practice and turned instead to drawing, to the production of diagrammatic drawings and related forms of notation in which minimalist principles such as serial progression and modular repetition are generated through the application of various mapping systems based on simple mathematical formulas, counting procedures, and the like. And simultaneously, for several years, Bochner also continued to use the camera, working through a lengthy sequence of experiments with the photographic representation of abstract principles and perception, color, form, and scale, testing the limit conditions of objectivity in that context with respect to the camera as a recording device. Finally, then, while 36 photographs and 12 diagrams is an exercise in many things that are internal to the logic of Bochner's practice, it also represents a diagnosis of the role of the camera in relation to sculpture's changing terms. Here is the Bochner again with the work of Andres that was first made in 1959, then used for firewood and remade on the occasion of an exhibition in 1970. The alternate narrative regarding photographic evidence of the minimalist object is not one that anticipates the disappearance of the object with the rise of conceptualism, an historical cliche that has proven to be of limited value over time. I use minimal and conceptual as terms of convenience, although I would ideally bracket them out in favor of identifying a series of changing imperatives. Rather than the gradual disappearance of the object, this period of work demonstrates the object's intensification. The object may function as a kind of support for the work, but in exactly this way, in that it is variable but necessary, and it is constantly recuperated or remade, the developing role of the object signifies a thickening of material means. Again, as historians, we're apt to use the minimalist object as a kind of cipher, paying little attention to specificity, to the version we refer to, if any, in order to represent what matters about the work. But as curators, when it comes to time to reactivate the work in the space of a room, what it is we actually choose to show and how it is we show it are, as considerations, intractably real. There is surely a separate thesis to pursue here with respect to the collision of historical and curatorial practice, as well as conservation, and the historical longing figured by the elusiveness of a work that is represented by multiple objects, or, with respect to the photographic record, by none at all. For now, it's enough to say that the iterative nature of the object, sometimes preserved, sometimes refabricated, sometimes multiplied, and sometimes all of those things at once, tests aesthetic claims regarding works that may have been propositional, but that were, after all, often strategically grounded in the persistence of the object as, first and foremost, a material thing. It's not the object, then, but the unique object that grew unstable. Flavin, Morris, and Andre are all on record as having harbored much antipathy for the camera. Let this be our cue as to the inadvertent but intrinsic relevance of the camera to the conflicted identity of the objects of minimal art, the endless flow of lost sculptures. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. We have time for a couple of questions.
Oops. Thank you so much. I'm wondering what might happen to your account, your arguments, if, especially in the case of Robert Morris, we look deeper into his relation to Yvonne Rainer, Simone Forti, and some of the text pieces that he had early written, these descriptions of constructions that he would eventually make, which took on a kind of almost Fluxus event score-like quality, and which were originally included in some Fluxus publications. I'm wondering if the score could figure into your narrative at all, or how that might change or augment your argument.
The score is a very good model for some aspects of this, but not for all of them, which is one of the reasons why any model that you choose from another medium tends to kind of, it holds up for just so long. Part of what I'm trying to, so it's completely apt to a degree, but there was no formal practice of that kind on Morris's part. He did it now and then, and he also used contracts and other forms of paperwork in order to sell work or to allow it to be shown in other places when he didn't want to have to ship it, or it maybe didn't even exist in object form. So there are so many different forms of remaking, replicating, or iterating existing works in multiple objective forms that recourse to the score alone, which would then relocate the practice in the context of performance, is useful, but I would say is limited given the life of the work over time. And I especially mean the life of the work beyond this period of time as well, because I'm referring in part to what happens to the work over the course of decades.
Jeffrey, thank you so much. What you just said about the life of the work over decades sort of resonates with another factor of these three artists that you choose, and that is that they're all three of them still alive. And so this process of replication...
Well, Flavin is not still alive.
Not Flavin, sorry, okay. Andre,
Morris and Bachner, sure. Mm-hmm.
Right. Those are the three I had in mind. This makes me think about your prediction for the time after which they're dead, and whether or not willy-nilly some sort of erratic patina will end up on these objects. When I saw the Deacon installation of Andre, I thought it had the older ones already were getting it, but I am very curious to know what you think.
Yeah, it's a huge topic, and part of this work comes out of a project that I'm conducting at the Guggenheim Museum that is devoted to the Panza holdings of minimal and post-minimal and conceptual art. And one of the things that's been very interesting to me and challenging to me as an historian and a critic on the one hand versus a curator on the other, and the two things hopefully intersect but not always, is that we are faced with making practical decisions on behalf of these bodies of work that force us to face choices that in an academic setting we don't have to make. So over the course of time, these objects have taken multiple forms, some of them better than others according to certain criteria, but the very criteria themselves that we apply are up for grabs so often. And in the context of work by artists who are still alive, we've conducted extensive interviews, especially in this case with Morris. And we've learned many interesting things, but primarily for today's purposes, I guess I would emphasize the fact that they changed their mind a lot over time. So something that I'm not used to facing is, and in fact it's still going on. The conversation with Morris, and I could do this for hours, I won't, I promise. The conversation with Morris taken many, many different turns, and we are struggling to get him to work with us on some final determinations on behalf of works that either were badly made and we can't show them anymore in that form, or currently don't exist as objects, but only as works that can be realized now or in the future. And it's been very interesting experience, which is a euphemism for frustrating. And but it does go to the question of identity and status of the object in ways that I never expected before. And it also speaks to this idea of aura, which is to say that objects that exist from the 1960s, when they exist, and there are fewer of them left than you might think. In the case of both Flavin and Morris, Andre maybe less so, acquire an aura that artists themselves those artists tend to resent. And it's a very interesting topic of conversation in relation to not just history and the original conceptual terms of the practice, but in relation as well to mortality, because they're all older and they're facing their own demise and, of course, the future of the work in posthumous form, which is one of the things that makes this conversation so intense. Sure.